On May 9, 1945, a convoy of American jeeps rolled into the Austrian resort town of Fishhorn, following intelligence reports about a high-value Nazi target hiding in a nearby castle. What they found exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. In a luxurious villa surrounded by stolen art worth millions, guarded by a small contingent of Luftwaffe personnel still wearing their uniforms, sat Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of Germany, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and until 3 weeks earlier, Adolf Hitler's designated successor. But the man the Americans found bore little resemblance to the powerful figure who had once terrorized Europe from the cockpit of the Nazi war machine. Göring was grotesquely overweight, weighing nearly 300 pounds and dressed in a theatrical costume that seemed more appropriate for an opera than for a war criminal facing capture. He wore a powder blue uniform of his own design, adorned with medals he had awarded himself, and carried a jewel-encrusted marshal's baton that symbolized an authority he no longer possessed. When the American soldiers entered, Göring didn't try to flee or resist. Instead, he smiled, extended his hand, and said in accented English, "I am Hermann Göring. I am the most important man you will ever capture." He genuinely believed this was true. He thought he was about to negotiate Germany's surrender as an equal with Allied leaders. He imagined himself dining with Eisenhower, discussing the post-war order with Churchill, perhaps even being recognized as a reasonable Nazi who could help rebuild Germany under Allied supervision. Instead, he was about to experience the most humiliating descent in modern military history. From Hitler's chosen heir to a broken prisoner begging for morphine, from a man who commanded the loyalty of millions to an object of contempt and mockery, Hermann Göring's capture and the weeks that followed would strip away every illusion he had carefully constructed about himself over the previous 20 years. This is the story of that fall, not just the moment of capture, but the psychological unraveling that preceded it, and the physical and moral collapse that followed. It's a story about addiction, delusion, and the ultimate price of loyalty to a criminal regime. To understand the depth of Göring's fall, you first need to understand how high he had risen. Hermann Göring was not some minor Nazi functionary or opportunistic late joiner to the party. He was there from the beginning, one of Hitler's earliest and most valuable supporters, and his credentials were impeccable from a Nazi perspective. Born in 1893 to a family with both diplomatic and military backgrounds, Göring had served as a fighter pilot in World War I, earning the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. He had shot down 22 enemy aircraft and commanded the famous Richthofen Squadron after the Red Baron's death. When the war ended, he was a genuine war hero with legitimate combat credentials that most Nazi leaders could only dream of. He joined the Nazi Party in 1922, and his combination of military prestige, aristocratic connections, and willingness to use violence made him invaluable to Hitler's rise. Göring organized the SA's street fighting units, provided respectability to the movement by lending his war hero status to Nazi rallies, and used his upper-class connections to introduce Hitler to wealthy donors and military leaders. During the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, Göring was shot in the groin and had to flee Germany to avoid arrest. It was during his exile in Sweden that he became addicted to morphine, prescribed for the pain from his wound. This addiction would haunt him for the rest of his life and play a crucial role in his eventual capture and humiliation. But when the Nazi Party returned to power in the early 1930s, Göring returned with it, and his rise was meteoric. He became president of the Reichstag in 1932, minister-president of Prussia in 1933, and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe when it was officially established in 1935. In 1940, after the conquest of France, Hitler created a special rank just for Göring, Reichsmarshal, making him the highest-ranking military officer in Germany and officially designating him as Hitler's successor. At his peak, Göring controlled vast networks of power. The Luftwaffe was his personal fiefdom. The Gestapo had been his creation before Himmler took it over. He ran Germany's four-year plan for economic mobilization, controlling industry and resources. He amassed a personal fortune through art theft and industrial corruption, building Corinna Hall, his massive estate north of Berlin, into a palace filled with stolen masterpieces worth tens of millions of dollars. But this power came with a price: absolute loyalty to Hitler. And as the war turned against Germany, that loyalty would become a trap from which Göring could not escape. The beginning of Göring's fall can be traced to the Battle of Britain in 1940. Hitler had promised the German people and military that the Luftwaffe, under Göring's command, would destroy the Royal Air Force and make a British invasion possible. Göring, always boastful and overconfident, had assured Hitler that his Air Force would bring Britain to its knees within weeks. It didn't happen. The Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority over Britain. German pilots were shot down in numbers that shocked the Nazi leadership. The planned invasion was postponed indefinitely, and for the first time, the Wehrmacht had failed to achieve a major objective. Hitler's confidence in Göring began to erode. More importantly, Göring's confidence in himself began to crack. He had built his position on an image of martial competence and strategic genius. The Battle of Britain exposed this as largely illusion, based more on propaganda than reality. As the war dragged on, the failures multiplied. The Luftwaffe couldn't prevent Allied bombing of German cities, it couldn't maintain air superiority on the Eastern Front, it couldn't stop the Allied invasion of Sicily or Italy or Normandy. With each failure, Hitler's anger at Göring grew, and Göring's response was to retreat further into drug addiction and denial. By 1943, Göring was spending most of his time at Hall, away from Hitler's headquarters and the bitter reality of Germany's military situation. He would arrive at meetings hours late, if at all. When he did appear, he was often obviously drugged, his pupils dilated, his speech slurred, his attention wandering. His morphine addiction had spiraled out of control. He was taking massive doses daily, supplemented with other drugs provided by his personal physicians. The medications affected everything: his judgment, his appearance, his ability to function. He gained enormous amounts of weight, his face became bloated and pale, and his once sharp mind became foggy and disconnected from reality. Hitler's other subordinates noticed and began maneuvering against him. Himmler, Goebbels, Bormann, they all saw opportunity in Göring's decline. They whispered to Hitler about Göring's incompetence, his corruption, his drug addiction. They suggested that perhaps the Reichsmarschall was no longer fit for his position, or perhaps not truly loyal to the Führer. But Hitler, for all his growing anger at Göring's failures, never completely abandoned his old comrade. There was genuine affection between them, or at least the Nazi version of affection, a bond forged in the early struggles of the party. Hitler would rage at Göring, humiliate him in front of other officers, and threaten to remove him from command. But he never actually did it, and he never revoked Göring's status as his successor. This would prove to be Göring's ultimate undoing. By April 1945, the military situation was hopeless. Soviet forces were in Berlin's suburbs. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into Germany's heartland. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had less than 3 weeks of existence remaining. Hitler was trapped in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, refusing to leave even as Soviet artillery systematically destroyed the city above him. Most of the Nazi leadership had fled Berlin, some heading north toward Denmark and possible escape by sea, others heading south toward the Alpine Redoubt, a supposed final defensive position in the Bavarian mountains. Göring had left Berlin on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, traveling south with a massive convoy of trucks carrying his art collection, jewelry, and personal possessions. He had also brought his wife Emmy and their daughter Edda, determined to keep his family safe as the Reich collapsed around them. He established himself in Berchtesgaden, near Hitler's famous Eagle's Nest retreat in the Bavarian Alps. It was from here that he would make the decision that would cost him everything. On April 23rd, Göring received a message from Berlin. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and one of Göring's many enemies in the Nazi hierarchy, informed him that Hitler was now completely cut off in Berlin, surrounded by Soviet forces with no possibility of escape. The message suggested that Hitler was no longer capable of governing effectively. This put Göring in an impossible position. According to the decree Hitler had issued in 1941, Göring was to assume leadership of the Reich if Hitler became incapacitated or unable to govern. The situation in Berlin certainly seemed to qualify. Soviet forces were literally fighting in the streets around the bunker. Hitler's orders had become increasingly disconnected from reality. From any rational perspective, Hitler could no longer effectively lead Germany. But Göring also knew that Hitler was paranoid, suspicious, and prone to interpreting any initiative by subordinates as betrayal or attempted power grabs. The wrong move could cost Göring not just his position, but his life. After conferring with his staff and legal advisors, Göring decided to send a carefully worded telegram to Hitler in Berlin. He would present his assumption of leadership not as a power grab, but as a loyal subordinate dutifully following the succession decree Hitler himself had established. The telegram read, "My Führer, in view of your decision to remain at your post in the fortress of Berlin, do you agree that I take over, at once, the total leadership of the Reich, with full freedom of action at home and abroad, as your deputy, in accordance with your decree of 29 June 1941. If no reply is received by 10 o'clock tonight, I shall take it for granted that you have lost your freedom of action, and shall act for the best interests of our country and our people. You know what I feel for you in this gravest hour of my life. Words fail me to express myself. May God protect you and speed you quickly here in spite of all. Your loyal Hermann Göring." To Göring, this seemed like a reasonable, even carefully respectful approach to a difficult situation. He was giving Hitler the option to retain command if he chose to do so, while also providing a mechanism for orderly succession if Hitler could not or would not respond. But the telegram was intercepted and shown to Hitler not just by communications staff, but by Martin Bormann, who immediately cast it in the worst possible light. Bormann, who had been maneuvering against Göring for years, told Hitler that this was clearly an ultimatum, a naked power grab by Göring, who was trying to push Hitler aside and seize control of the Reich while the Führer was still alive. Hitler's reaction was explosive. The man who had just learned of Himmler's betrayal in attempting to negotiate surrender with the Allies now believed that Göring too was betraying him. In Hitler's paranoid final days, everyone except a tiny inner circle was a traitor, and now even Göring, the faithful old fighter from the early days of the party, had joined the conspiracy against him. Hitler immediately ordered Göring's arrest. He stripped him of all ranks, offices, and party membership. He expelled him from the Nazi Party and removed him as successor, replacing him with Admiral Dönitz, a man Hitler barely knew, but who at least hadn't sent any presumptuous telegrams from Bavaria. More ominously, Hitler gave orders that if Berlin fell and he died, Göring was to be executed. The message sent to the SS in Berchtesgaden was clear. Hermann Göring was now a traitor, and traitors deserved death. When the SS arrived at Göring's residence in Berchtesgaden on the evening of April 23rd, they informed him that he was under arrest by order of the Führer. Göring was stunned. The carefully worded telegram that he had thought demonstrated his loyalty had instead been interpreted as betrayal. Everything he had built over 20 years in the Nazi hierarchy had just collapsed. The SS placed Göring and his family under house arrest. They were confined to his residence, surrounded by guards who made it clear they were prisoners, not protected guests. The SS commander informed Göring that if Hitler died in Berlin, Göring would be executed immediately. For the next week, Göring lived in a state of suspended terror. News from Berlin was sporadic and confused. He knew that Soviet forces were closing in on Hitler's bunker, that the end was near. But he didn't know if Hitler's execution order would be carried out, or if the chaos of the Reich's collapse might save him. His morphine addiction became even more acute during this period. Cut off from his usual suppliers and facing the possibility of execution, Göring increased his drug use to manage his anxiety. His personal physicians continued to provide him with medications, though the supply was becoming increasingly uncertain as Germany's infrastructure collapsed. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Göring didn't learn of this immediately, but when he did, he must have experienced a moment of hope. Hitler was dead, which meant the execution order died with him. Göring was no longer in danger of immediate execution. But his problems were far from over. The new government under Admiral Dönitz had no interest in rehabilitating Göring. He remained under house arrest, and as American forces advanced into Bavaria, it became clear that he would soon be captured by the Allies. As American forces swept through southern Germany in early May 1945, Göring faced a crucial decision. He could try to flee, perhaps to Switzerland or to the Alpine Redoubt, if it actually existed. He could hide and hope to evade capture. Or he could surrender, preferably to the Americans rather than the Soviets or the French, who would be far less likely to treat him well given the Luftwaffe's role in bombing their countries. Göring chose surrender, but not just any surrender. He convinced himself that he could negotiate his way through the post-war period. He was, after all, Reichsmarschall Göring, Hitler's designated successor until just days ago, a military officer of the highest rank. Surely the Americans would recognize his status and treat him accordingly. This delusion was remarkable given the circumstances. Germany had just lost the most destructive war in human history. The Nazi regime had committed atrocities that were only now beginning to be fully documented as Allied forces liberated concentration camps. Göring himself had been instrumental in establishing the apparatus of Nazi terror and had personally enriched himself through the systematic looting of occupied territories. But Göring's drug-addled mind could not or would not process these realities. He imagined himself as a military officer surrendering with honor after a hard-fought campaign. He thought he would be treated as a legitimate head of state, afforded diplomatic courtesies, perhaps even consulted about the post-war reconstruction of Germany. On May 8th, the day Germany officially surrendered, Göring sent messages to American forces indicating his willingness to surrender. He specified that he wanted to meet with General Eisenhower personally, and that he expected to be treated according to his rank as Reichsmarschall. The Americans were interested, but not for the reasons Göring hoped. They wanted to capture high-ranking Nazis for intelligence purposes, and eventually for war crimes trials. Göring's belief that he would be a negotiating partner rather than a prisoner was about to be shattered. The American convoy arrived at Göring's location on May 9th. The unit was from the 36th Infantry Division, and they had been briefed that they were capturing a high-value target, but perhaps not fully prepared for the theatrical spectacle they were about to witness. Göring had prepared meticulously for this encounter. He had dressed in one of his elaborate uniforms, powder blue, a color he favored because he thought it complemented his complexion. The uniform was covered with medals, many of which he had simply awarded himself over the years. He carried his jewel-encrusted marshal's baton and had instructed his remaining Luftwaffe guards to be in full-dress uniform as well. When the American soldiers entered, Göring stood and extended his hand in greeting, as if welcoming dinner guests rather than the military forces of a nation he had been at war with for years. He introduced himself formally. "I am Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich. I wish to speak with General Eisenhower as soon as possible." The American soldiers, most of them enlisted men in their 20s, were stunned by the spectacle. They had been expecting a defeated Nazi leader, perhaps hiding in civilian clothes or attempting to flee. Instead, they found this grotesquely overweight man in a theatrical costume behaving as if he were hosting a diplomatic reception. Brigadier General Robert Stack, who arrived shortly after the initial contact, later described the scene as surreal. Göring insisted on having his photograph taken with American officers, as if documenting a friendly meeting between allies. He asked about accommodations and requested that his personal baggage, which filled several trucks, be transported along with him. The Americans were initially somewhat bemused by Göring's delusions, but they also recognized the propaganda value of his capture. They took the photographs Göring requested, knowing they would be valuable in showing the German people and the world that the Nazi leadership had been completely defeated and captured. Göring was transported first to a temporary holding facility at Augsburg, then to the interrogation center at Mondorf-les-Bonnes in Luxembourg, which Allied intelligence had codenamed Ashcan. It was during the journey to Mondorf that the first cracks appeared in Göring's carefully maintained delusion. The first indication that Göring's capture would not proceed as he imagined came when American guards searched his personal luggage. They found an enormous quantity of drugs, morphine, paracodeine, and other narcotics sufficient to supply a small hospital. They also found jewelry, gold, and stolen art worth millions. The Americans immediately confiscated the drugs. They also began treating Göring not as a diplomatic guest, but as a prisoner. He was assigned a cell, not a suite. He was given standard prison clothing, not allowed to wear his uniforms, and, most importantly, he was not taken to meet with General Eisenhower or any other senior Allied commander. Instead, he was processed like any other POW, photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a prisoner number. Göring's reaction to these procedures was telling. He alternated between outrage, didn't they know who he was, and attempts at charm, trying to befriend his captors with stories about his flying exploits in World War I or his early days with Hitler. Neither approach worked. The American medical staff at Mondorf, led by Dr. Douglas Kelly, had orders to detoxify Göring and get him healthy enough to stand trial. They understood that this would be extremely difficult, both medically and psychologically, but it was essential if Göring was to be prosecuted effectively. What followed was one of the most dramatic and humiliating experiences of Göring's life. The Ashcan detention facility at Mondorf-les-Bonnes had been a luxury hotel before the war. The Allies had converted it into an interrogation center for high-ranking Nazi prisoners, and by the time Göring arrived in mid-May 1945, it was filling up with captured Nazi officials. Göring's cell was comfortable by prison standards, but nothing like the luxury he had grown accustomed to over the previous 12 years. Most importantly, it contained no drugs. The American medical staff began a controlled detoxification program, gradually reducing Göring's morphine intake over several weeks rather than stopping it abruptly, which could have been fatal. The withdrawal was excruciating. Göring experienced all the classic symptoms: severe pain, nausea, sweating, shaking, anxiety, and insomnia. But worse than the physical symptoms were the psychological ones. For over 20 years, Göring's morphine had been his escape from reality. his way of managing stress and avoiding difficult truths. Now, forced to confront reality without chemical assistance, he began to crumble. Dr. Kelly, the American psychiatrist overseeing Göring's detoxification, kept detailed notes on the process. He described Göring in the early days at Ashcan as a pitiful figure, alternately demanding drugs and weeping about his fate. The arrogant Reichsmarschall who had insisted on meeting Eisenhower was replaced by a man begging guards for just one more dose, promising he would cooperate with interrogations if they would only give him his medication. The other Nazi prisoners at Ashcan watched Göring's deterioration with a mixture of schadenfreude and horror. Many of them had resented Göring's corruption and incompetence during the war years. Now they saw him revealed as a drug addict who had been making crucial military decisions while under the influence of morphine. Some felt vindicated in their previous criticisms. Others worried about what his collapse said about all of them. As the drugs left Göring's system over the course of weeks, a remarkable physical transformation occurred. He began to lose weight dramatically. Without morphine suppressing his metabolism and distorting his appetite, and on a controlled prison diet far less lavish than what he had enjoyed at Karrenhall, the pounds began to melt away. By the end of the summer, Göring had lost over 80 pounds. His face, which had been puffy and bloated, became more defined. His body, which had become grotesquely obese, slimmed down to something approaching normal proportions. American medical staff monitoring his health were astonished by the transformation. But the physical changes were accompanied by psychological ones that were even more dramatic. As the morphine fog lifted, Göring's natural intelligence and cunning began to reassert themselves. The man who had spent the last years of the war in a drug-addled haze was replaced by someone sharper, more aware, and more dangerous from an interrogation perspective. Göring realized what was happening to him and what was likely to come. He understood that he would be put on trial for war crimes. He recognized that his previous behavior, the theatrical costumes, the demands to meet Eisenhower, the assumption that he would be treated as a dignified prisoner of war, had been delusional. He decided on a new strategy. He would cooperate with Allied interrogators to a point, providing information that would make him seem useful. But he would also begin preparing his defense for the inevitable war crimes trial. He started requesting books on international law and asking about the legal basis for any charges that might be brought against him. As Göring became healthier and more mentally alert, he also became more difficult for Allied interrogators. In his first interrogations, while still heavily drugged, he had been rambling and unfocused, sometimes providing useful information simply because he couldn't maintain a coherent defensive strategy. Now drug-free and increasingly sharp, he became evasive, deflecting questions and trying to minimize his role in Nazi crimes. The interrogators quickly realized they were dealing with a very intelligent man who understood the legal danger he was in. Göring would talk at length about military strategy, about Hitler's decision-making process, about the internal politics of the Nazi regime. But when questions turned to war crimes, the bombing of civilian populations, the persecution of Jews, the use of slave labor, he became suddenly vague and forgetful. "I was only following orders" became a constant refrain, though Göring was too smart to use those exact words. Instead, he would claim he had been too busy with military matters to know what the SS was doing in occupied territories. He would insist that the concentration camps were run by Himmler, not by him. He would admit to knowing about anti-Jewish laws, but claim ignorance of the systematic murder that those laws facilitated. The interrogators knew he was lying. They had captured enormous quantities of Nazi documents, and many of those documents bore Göring's signature. Orders for the confiscation of Jewish property, directives establishing forced labor programs, communications about the logistics of transporting Jews to the East. Göring's name and authority appeared throughout the paper trail of Nazi crimes. One interrogator, confronting Göring with a document he had signed ordering the seizure of Jewish businesses, watched as Göring carefully examined the paper, acknowledged the signature was his, and then claimed he had signed it without reading it carefully and hadn't understood the implications. When the interrogator pointed out that Göring's own notes were in the margins of the document, showing he had read it carefully, Göring simply shrugged and changed the subject. It was this combination of intelligence, evasion, and shamelessness that would characterize Göring's behavior throughout his detention and eventual trial at Nuremberg. In October 1945, Göring and other high-ranking Nazi prisoners were transferred from Ashcan to Nuremberg, where they would stand trial before an international military tribunal. The choice of Nuremberg was symbolic. It had been the site of the massive Nazi Party rallies that had showcased the Third Reich's power and pageantry. Now it would be the site of the regime's final reckoning. By the time of the transfer, Göring had completed his physical transformation. He had lost over 90 pounds and looked more like the fighter pilot of World War I than the grotesque figure the Americans had captured in May. His mind was sharp, probably sharper than it had been in a decade, and he had decided on his strategy for the trial. Göring would not deny his role in the Nazi regime. That would be impossible, given his prominence and the documentary evidence. Instead, he would attempt to defend Nazism itself, to argue that everything he had done was in service of Germany's legitimate interests. He would portray himself as a patriot and a soldier, not a criminal. And he would try to dominate the trial proceedings, to turn the courtroom into a stage where he could present himself as the real leader of the Nazi movement, implicitly claiming a status above even Hitler. This strategy was audacious, and from a legal perspective, almost certainly doomed to failure. But it reveals something important about Göring's psychology. Even facing overwhelming evidence of his crimes and certain conviction, he could not bring himself to show contrition or accept responsibility. His ego, even after everything that had happened, would not allow him to appear weak or apologetic. When the Nuremberg trial began on November 20, 1945, Hermann Göring was the most prominent defendant. Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels were dead by suicide. Many other top Nazis had been killed in the war or were in hiding. Göring was the highest-ranking Nazi leader the Allies had managed to capture alive. He sat in the first seat of the defendant's dock, a position he had specifically requested and been granted. From this position, he intended to lead the other defendants, to coordinate their defense strategies, and to present himself as the voice of the Nazi regime. In the early days of the trial, Göring succeeded in this role to a remarkable degree. He was attentive and engaged during proceedings, taking notes and passing messages to other defendants during breaks. He would nod or shake his head in response to testimony, trying to signal to the court and to his co-defendants whether they should accept or reject various assertions. When prosecution witnesses described Nazi atrocities, Göring maintained a pose of dignified skepticism, as if he were hearing these things for the first time and found them hard to believe. When documents bearing his signature were introduced, he would lean forward, examine them through the translation headphones, and occasionally shrug as if to suggest the documents were out of context or their significance was exaggerated. But the prosecutors had been preparing for this. They had spent months organizing a devastating case based on the Nazis' own documents. When Göring finally took the stand in his own defense in March 1946, they were ready to destroy the image he had been trying to construct. Göring's direct testimony was actually quite effective from a defense perspective. He was articulate, occasionally charming, and presented himself as a reasonable military officer who had been serving his country's interests. He admitted to implementing anti-Jewish laws, but claimed these were defensive measures against Jewish economic power. He acknowledged the bombing of civilian areas, but argued this was standard military practice used by all sides. He took responsibility for his actions, but framed them as patriotic duty rather than criminal behavior. But then came the cross-examination by American prosecutor Robert Jackson. Jackson had been preparing for this moment for months, and he systematically dismantled Göring's defense. Using Göring's own words from speeches and documents, Jackson showed that Göring had not been a reluctant follower, but an enthusiastic architect of Nazi aggression and terror. Jackson confronted Göring with a speech he had given in 1938, boasting about his role in establishing the concentration camps. Göring tried to claim he had meant something different, that the camps were only for political prisoners and had been humane. Jackson then produced documents showing that Göring had ordered the expansion of the camp system and had been briefed regularly on the brutal conditions within them. The prosecution introduced evidence of Göring's massive corruption, the art stolen from Jewish collectors, the businesses seized and given to Nazi officials, the palaces built with looted funds. They showed that Göring had personally profited from every crime the Nazi regime committed, accumulating wealth that made him one of the richest men in Europe while millions starved and died. Most devastatingly, they presented evidence of Göring's direct involvement in the Holocaust. While it was true that Himmler and the SS had carried out the actual murders, Göring had signed the orders that made it possible. In July 1941, he had signed a directive ordering Reinhard Heydrich to prepare a total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. This document, presented in court, directly connected Göring to the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. Göring's response was a combination of evasion, technical legal arguments, and finally, exhausted silence. The drug-free clarity that had made him dangerous in interrogations now worked against him. He understood exactly what the evidence proved, and he knew there was no effective defense possible. On October 1, 1946, nearly a year after the trial began, the verdicts were read. Hermann Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. The sentence was death by hanging. For Göring, the method of execution was particularly humiliating. He was a military officer who, in his own mind, had fought honorably for his country. He believed he deserved a soldier's death, execution by firing squad. Hanging was for common criminals, and Göring could not accept being treated as such. He petitioned the tribunal to change his sentence to death by firing squad. The request was denied. He wrote personal letters to Allied commanders pleading for this consideration. They were ignored. In the end, even this small dignity was denied him. But Göring would have the last word, in a sense. On the night of October 15, 1946, just hours before he was scheduled to be hanged, Hermann Göring committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule he had somehow managed to conceal throughout his captivity. How he obtained or hid the poison remains a mystery. Some speculate it was hidden in his personal effects, others suggest a sympathetic guard provided it. His death deprived the Allies of the satisfaction of executing him, which was probably exactly his intention. But it also confirmed what everyone already knew, that even at the very end, Hermann Göring was more concerned with his image and his ego than with facing the consequences of his actions. The story of Hermann Göring's capture and fall is not just about one man's humiliation. It's a story about the collapse of an entire system built on violence, lies, and the systematic dehumanization of millions. Göring's journey from Hitler's designated heir to broken prisoner, from commander of millions to drug-addled captive begging for morphine, represents the inevitable endpoint of fascist ideology. The power, the pageantry, the theatrical uniforms and medals, all of it was built on a foundation of murder and theft. When that foundation was finally exposed, the entire structure collapsed with remarkable speed. In the 6 months between his capture in May 1945 and the start of his trial in November, Göring went through a transformation that was physical, mental, and in some ways moral. The drugs left his system, the weight fell away, his mind cleared, and for perhaps the first time in decades, he was forced to confront reality without chemical anesthesia or the protective bubble of Nazi power. What he found in that reality was damning. The documents didn't lie. The evidence was overwhelming. And despite his intelligence and his legal maneuvering, he could not escape the simple truth that he had been instrumental in some of the greatest crimes in human history. His final act, suicide by cyanide just hours before his scheduled execution, was consistent with everything that had come before. Hermann Göring never accepted responsibility, never showed genuine remorse, never acknowledged the humanity of his victims. He died as he had lived, concerned primarily with his own image, his own interests, and his own ego. Today, Göring is remembered not as the great military leader he imagined himself to be, but as a war criminal, a drug addict, and a symbol of the moral bankruptcy at the heart of Nazism. His humiliating capture and the degradation that followed serve as a reminder that no amount of power, no quantity of stolen wealth, and no degree of self-delusion can ultimately protect those who build their lives on the suffering of others. If this deep dive into history was valuable to you, please like and subscribe. We bring you the untold stories and hidden details.